the pastry that sparked a war. Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip into your dreams with the soft, flaky crust of one of the weirdest military conflicts in European history, a war so ridiculously unnecessary that it started over a desert. Yes, really, a pastry. You walk slowly through the cobbled streets of 19th century Denmark, the fog curling lazily around your ankles like a sleepy cat. And as you pass a bakery, the scent of butter and almonds wraps around your senses. It's warm, it's welcoming. But behind this innocent fragrance lies the spark of international chaos. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1838, and Denmark home of cozy hike vibes. Viking helmets that were never actually worn into battle. And a very proud tradition of puff pastry is ruled by King Christian VIII. Not exactly the guy you'd expect to be at the center of a confectionery-related crisis, but such are the fates of monarchs who want everything just so. Meanwhile, a tiny nearby duchy called Schleswig-Holstein, yes, it's a real place, and no, I didn't sneeze. While typing, it was caught in a long tug-of-war between Danish and German influence. This region is basically the croissant of Europe, flaky, layered, and constantly being claimed by whoever feels hungriest for power at the time. The Danish monarchy wanted to keep Schleswig and Holstein close, partly for national pride, partly for access to warm ports, and possibly just possibly because someone, somewhere in court, was seriously craving an almond tart. Now, here's where it gets wonderfully petty. Legend, and I say legend because even scholars debate how much of this is poetic gossip and how much is actual policy. Has it that a Prussian diplomat visiting a Danish border town was served a local pastry? A pretty standard thing in polite European diplomatic circles, right? Except this pastry was slightly burnt, underfilled, or maybe just served with a bit too much Danish attitude. The details vary, but the bottom line, he was insulted, deeply, monumentally, possibly hungry. And when Prussia feels insulted, they do what all insecure empires do, start sharpening bayonets. Now, to be fair, this wasn't just about a pastry. The pastry just became a symbol like that one coworker who microwaves fish in the office kitchen. It's not about the fish. It's about everything else that's already wrong. Tensions between Denmark and German-speaking territories had been simmering for decades. The 1830s saw nationalistic ideas blooming all over Europe. Like wild dandelions, no monarch could quite control. The people of Schleswig-Holstein, many of whom spoke German and felt closer to Berlin than to Copenhagen, were getting restless. The Danish crown, on the other hand, was trying to make sure its borders didn't melt like a soft eclair in the sun. And so, with lines being drawn, egos inflated, and pride puffed up to bakery levels, it was only a matter of time before the rolling pins turned into rifles. A mainstream historical fact you'll find in most textbooks is that the conflict formerly known as the First Schleswig War began in 1848 and lasted until 1851, involving Denmark, Prussia, and various German Confederation states. But what you might not read in your standard history book is that prior to the war's official start, there were dozens of smaller spats diplomatic glares, aggressive bakery reviews, and passive-aggressive military posturing. The pastry war nickname didn't emerge until years later, probably coined by some smug journalist with a flair for drama, or a particularly poetic general who didn't want to admit he'd been fighting over flan. Fringe fact: some Danish records suggest that at least one Danish outpost, during a border scuffle, offered enemy troops pastries as a peace offering. No gunfire, just cinnamon and cardamom. Scholars argue whether this ever truly happened, but doesn't it just sound wonderfully human? Imagine two cold, shivering soldiers staring across a foggy field, and instead of firing muskets, one offers the other a buttered kringle. It's the kind of war you'd almost want to be drafted into. You remember that even wars over desert leave real scars. Now, here's where historians still debate like academic gladiators in tweed. Was the so-called pastry incident an actual cause of the conflict, or just a tasty myth layered onto the cake of war after the fact? Some argue that calling it the Pastry War trivializes the serious ethnic and political tensions that existed between Danes and Germans at the time. Others insist that these seemingly silly moments matter, because they show how human emotion, pride, and yes, even hunger can influence global events. You're standing there now, outside the bakery, listening to the low hum of diplomatic tension rise like dough in a warm oven. Horses clop past, military boots scuff cobblestones, and from a window above, someone argues in a blend of Danish and German, words folding over one another like laminated pastry layers. You shift your weight. Maybe you're a Danish soldier. Maybe you're a bakery apprentice who just wants to sell crullers in peace. But you can feel it in the air. War is coming. Not because of a treaty or a tyrant. Because of a snack. You wouldn't survive this. Probably not, unless you're fluent in both languages and can run really fast while carrying a tray of hot desserts. So stay still, watch, learn, and maybe take mental notes for the next time. Someone underestimates the power of food-related diplomacy. The pettiest war in Europe's cookbook now. Imagine you're back in that same foggy street. Only this time it's the following morning. The bakery is quieter. The soldiers who passed by yesterday are gone, moved along to the outskirts of town where rumors of rebellion are starting to bubble like yeast. The once silly notion that a pastry could launch a war is starting to feel less silly. Because while Danish and German officials argue over which version of the Constitution applies to Schleswig-Holstein, common folk bakers, shoemakers, horse groomers are the ones caught in the crossfire of identity politics. See, Denmark's monarchy didn't just want to keep control of Schleswig and Holstein for kicks. The two duchies had strategic significance. Their ports allowed Denmark access to key trade routes, and losing them would feel like having your best chess piece taken before you even made a move. And unlike modern countries with clearer borders, the political status of Schleswig-Holstein was an absolute sponge cake of complexity. Schleswig was a fiefdom of Denmark, while Holstein was a member of the German Confederation, which meant 1 foot in Denmark, 1 foot in Germany, and a headache for anyone trying to draw a map. Now, let's zoom into the actual lives of people. In the duchies, families were often bilingual. Some spoke Danish in the morning and German by dinner. Cultural traditions overlapped. So when nationalists on both sides began insisting on purity and loyalty, the average farmer or cobbler was left thinking, why are we fighting again? It's not that they didn't care, it's that nobody had explained why identity had to come with bayonets. Imagine a teenager named Ansel in 1840s Holstein. His father is Danish, his mother is German. He helps bake bread in the morning and delivers it across both Danish and German-speaking neighborhoods. One day he hears that a new regulation requires him to speak only Danish in public schools. The next week, German nationalists are passing out pamphlets declaring Danish policies oppressive. Ansel is just trying to figure out if he still has a job. This tension simmered until it finally boiled over in 1848. That's when the First Schleswig War officially kicked off. But the lead up to it, that's where the petty really shines. There are records of officials refusing to dine together, or canceling agreements over small perceived slights like being served Danish rye instead of German white bread. The culinary symbolism was strong. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was national identity. And like many identity-based conflicts, the symbols ended up mattering more than the substance. On March 24, 1848, the German-speaking citizens of Schleswig-Holstein declared independence from Denmark. Denmark, in response, moved troops into the region. Prussia, seizing an opportunity to flex its military muscles and win points with German nationalists, intervened on behalf of the duchies, and just like that, the flour-dusted tension exploded. Into real war, trenches were dug. Cannons were wheeled into place. But here's the bizarre twist. This war, so deeply tied to symbolic identity, featured moments of almost comic absurdity. Danish troops reportedly tried to win over towns by handing out pastries and candy. A bizarre propaganda campaign included small pamphlets depicting Denmark as a protective mother and Germany as an aggressive uncle. Meanwhile, Prussian officers accused Danish forces of weaponizing sweetness. Seriously, letters recovered from soldiers include lines like, They tried to bribe the children with marzipan. We refused it. It smelled of trickery. If you're picturing uniformed men swatting away nougat with bayonets, you're not far off. And here's where the war really earns its place in the annals of absurdity. At one point during the siege of a small town in southern Jutland, Danish officers negotiated a ceasefire so that both sides could attend a local wedding. The groom had relatives on both fronts. They literally paused the war to eat cake together. For one day, everyone sat down, shared food, and raised toasts. Then, presumably, they returned to their posts and resumed shooting. This isn't some romanticized exaggeration. Diaries from the time describe the wedding in detail. The violin music, the pork roast, even the awkward glances exchanged between men who might have tried to kill each other the day before. It all feels too ridiculous to be true, but that's what makes it stick in your brain. War isn't always noble banners and grand speeches. Sometimes, it's passive-aggressive frosting and mispronounced family names. Now, let's not pretend there weren't serious consequences. The war resulted in over 6,000 deaths. Families were torn apart, towns were burned, and despite the temporary ceasefires and edible peace offerings, nothing was really resolved. By 1851, Denmark had regained control of Schleswig-Holstein, but only barely. Prussia had stepped back because it lost interest, but because international pressure, especially from Britain and Russia, forced a halt. Nobody wanted a full European conflict over a border dispute that had already gotten way out of hand. And yet, despite the war's bloody outcome, the legacy of its pettiness lingered. The term Pastry War stuck around. Not because it accurately described the military campaign, but because it captured the surreal, almost comical way that human emotion, insult, hunger could spiral into destruction. Textbooks may label it a national struggle, but the common people remembered it differently. An old woman in Flensburg once said, "I lost my brother to a war about which bread we should eat." In her memory, it wasn't about politics. It was about something much smaller and far sadder. So tonight, as you pull the covers around your shoulders and drift toward sleep, imagine being a messenger in 1848. You ride through misty fields, a satchel bouncing at your side, delivering urgent letters between confused generals. You pass soldiers who seem more interested in arguing over butter rations than battlefield formations. Somewhere in your pack, tucked between maps and orders, is a wrapped pastry. You're not even sure where it came from. Maybe it was given in kindness. Maybe it was meant as a bribe. But you eat it anyway because in the fog of war, a little sweetness is all you can trust. A treaty signed over toasted rye by the time the cannons quieted in the late spring of 1851. The fields of Schleswig and Holstein were not so much scarred as they were exhausted, trampled underfoot. Not just by armies, but by questions no soldier could answer. And here's where things take another turn into the realm of the absurd. Because the First Schleswig War, which had cost thousands of lives and achieved almost nothing in political clarity, didn't end with a dramatic surrender or a signed scroll in a grand hall. No, according to multiple eyewitness accounts, the war limped to its conclusion through a series of hesitant conversations, back-channel letters, and, perhaps most bafflingly, an informal celebratory meal where peace, at least temporarily, was declared with a round of toasted rye and a shot of schnapps. You see, after 3 years of mud, bayonets, and maps that nobody could agree on, the governments involved were tired. Denmark, battered and politically cornered, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity and keep its southern frontier. Prussia, on the other hand, found itself stuck in a diplomatic pickle, eager to assert its strength, but not quite ready to drag itself into a European war. Britain and Russia were watching, fingers twitching, ready to intervene if things spilled over. So instead of escalating, everyone blinked. They didn't call it surrender. They called it mutual disengagement, a phrase as vague and non-committal as it sounds. And while official paperwork would take months to finalize, the moment of peace, the symbolic sigh was shared in a manor house just outside the Danish town of Unwind. The house belonged to a local merchant who had somehow maintained neutrality throughout the conflict by offering his estate as a storage space for both Danish and German soldiers, depending on the week. He was, by all accounts, far more interested in preserving his wine cellar than taking sides. On a gray April morning, representatives from both factions arrived under separate banners. They didn't bring flags. They brought bread. Seriously, each delegation carried their region's preferred loaf. The Danish side arrived with hearty, dense rye, studded with caraway seeds. The Germans came with a lighter, crusty wheat bread, still warm from a local bakery. It wasn't just about sharing food, it was a symbolic gesture, an edible handshake. As ridiculous as it may seem, these loaves had been discussed in advance. There was a belief, perhaps naive, perhaps brilliant, that beginning the conversation with shared sustenance might disarm the hostility more effectively than drawn swords, and to an extent, it worked. One German officer reportedly said, "When you eat with a man, you stop seeing him as the enemy." He might have been paraphrasing an older proverb, but the sentiment stuck. The men sat around a long oak table, unadorned except for butter, cheese, and 3 varieties of pickled herring. There was no music, no grand speeches, just the sound of knives slicing crust, mugs clinking gently, and boots scraping the wooden floor. The talks that followed were quiet, measured, and, compared to the bombast of earlier declarations, almost sleepy. It's said that a Danish colonel raised a toast not in victory or sorrow, but in bewilderment. He looked around the room and said, "To the strangest war I've ever served in." Everyone drank, and in that toast, somewhere between the rye and the pickles, the war unofficially ended. Not with a bang, but a bite. Now let's zoom out for a moment. This wasn't the end of conflict in the region. Not by a long shot. The Second Schleswig War would erupt in just over a decade. But in 1851, for a brief time, the guns fell silent. And the reason that moment matters, the reason historians still talk about it with both reverence and bemusement is because it reminds us that war isn't always about banners and bullets. Sometimes, it's about bureaucracy, miscommunication, and a fundamental inability to agree on whose bread belongs. At the table, for the ordinary people of Schleswig-Holstein, the end of the war didn't mean peace. It meant uncertainty. A blacksmith named Otto wrote in his journal, "We do not know which language to teach our children. We wait for the next order, but no one sends it." Imagine living in a place where the flag might change next month, where the town's name could be spelled differently, depending on which officer rode through last. That's what peace looked like, less like celebration, more like confusion wrapped in silence. But there were small joys. Bakeries reopened, markets returned, and for one strange week, there was a local festival in the town of Haderslev, where Danish and German songs were sung side by side. A storyteller stood in the square and recounted a version of the war that made everyone laugh, not because it was accurate, but because it was absurd. He ended his tale with a mock recipe. To start a war, take 1 misunderstanding, add 3 arrogant ministers, sprinkle with national pride, and bake at full heat until lives are burned. People laughed. Some cried. Everyone clapped. That performance was later written down and became a folktale. Not about heroes or traitors, but about what happens when nations forget how to listen. And here's the thing, the petty pastry war weather. It began with a burned Danish, or not lingered in the cultural memory, not because it was devastating, but because it was human, so deeply, hilariously, and tragically human. And in a way, that's more haunting, because it shows how fragile peace can be. One wrong word, one symbolic dish, one declaration in the wrong language, and suddenly, you've got battalions on the move. As you settle into sleep tonight, think about the last scene at that long oak table. The sun has just begun to rise outside. One Danish officer pours another cup of coffee. A German counterpart passes the butter. They speak haltingly, in a mix of languages neither of them fully knows. They joke about the weather. One of them offers a piece of rye with a nod that says, "Let's not do this again." And for a brief, warm moment before governments resume, posturing and borders start shifting again, they are just men sharing bread, grateful to be alive. Bureaucrats, beards, and border maps. The aftermath of confusion in the weeks following that strange ceasefire declared over toasted rye and herring. The European press struggled mightily to explain what had happened. Newspapers in Copenhagen printed long, meandering paragraphs filled with diplomatic platitudes. Phrases like strategic reassessment of regional obligations and temporary halt to organized hostilities, which all sounded official, but translated to one thing. No one knew what to call it. In Berlin, editorials debated whether the honor of Prussia had been upheld or slightly scuffed, like a boot left out in the rain. British papers, ever enthusiastic in their sarcasm, ran headlines like "War over, before breakfast and tea and toast treaty ends northern dispute." But behind the scenes, a small army of bureaucrats, clerks, and cartographers now faced a new and terrible task: figuring out where the border was. You might imagine that in the 19th century, with all its advances in surveying and map-making, the borders of a place like Schleswig-Holstein would be precise. But you would be wrong. In fact, the line between Danish-held and German-administered lands shifted so often during the war, sometimes by miles, sometimes by mere inches, that entire villages had developed a sort of geographic identity crisis. One official in Flensburg wrote in frustration, "I have received instructions in both Danish and German. I shall follow whichever arrives first each morning." The biggest problem was this: treaties were vague, military advances had redrawn the landscape temporarily, and every town claimed allegiance to whichever side gave them better tax rates that month. Some villages switched flags 3 times in a week, not out of political conviction, but because the local mayors were just tired of soldiers stealing their cheese. As cartographers began redrawing the borderlines, they discovered a new horror. The existing maps didn't match. Danish maps listed streams and barns that didn't exist. German ones labeled forests that had been cut down years ago. One frustrated mapmaker, in Kiel, famously burst into laughter and began labeling every 3rd town possibly here, just to stay sane. But things got even weirder when language entered the mix. The dialects spoken in northern Schleswig were a tangled braid of Danish, Low German, Frisian, and local slang that made translation a nightmare. A treaty article might state, "The town of Eckernford shall remain under Danish control," only for the locals to point out that there were actually 2 towns by that name, one on the coast, one further inland, and no one could agree which was meant. In one infamous incident, a Danish officer attempting to enforce his new authority entered a village and delivered a stirring speech in Danish. The villagers, who spoke only Plattdeutsch and thought he was announcing a poetry competition, applauded and went about their day. The real danger wasn't violence, it was bureaucracy. Train schedules had to be rewritten, post routes redrawn, tax ledgers refiled, and none of the clerks had slept well in months. A story survives of a customs inspector named Jurgensen, who refused to recognize the new border until it was published in a font he could read. "I will not be ruled by italics," he declared, and staged a small protest by standing on a bridge and handing out pastries shaped like question marks. He was dismissed, but became something of a folk hero. Meanwhile, military officers weren't sure what to do with their troops. Some battalions remained stationed along the disputed marshlands, which everyone quietly agreed were too soggy to bother fighting over. Others were ordered to stand down entirely. But soldiers, left to their own devices, grew restless. One Danish captain, in an effort to maintain discipline, forced his men to build a wooden replica of Schleswig Castle out of beer barrels. It collapsed in the rain and was later inhabited by ducks. This confusion gave rise to an entire genre of military satire in the region. Songs, jokes, and puppet shows mocked the indecisiveness of commanders and the absurdity of a war that ended in what came to be called the Toast Room Accord. A popular tune in taverns went, "We marched at dawn, we fought till noon, we dined by dusk and called it truce." It had a catchy tune and was often accompanied by clinking mugs and dramatic reenactments using slices of rye as props. But amid the laughter, deeper tensions simmered. The people of Schleswig-Holstein, who had endured 3 years of disrupted farming, closed churches, and sons taken for service, wanted to know what their identity was now. Were they Danish, German, a buffer state? The Treaty of London, signed in May 1852, tried to answer that, but did so in the most diplomatic way possible, by saying very little clearly. It guaranteed the integrity of the Danish monarchy, confirmed Certain duchies would remain in personal union, and promised future consultations should any crisis arise, which is a historical way of saying, we'll talk about it later. The treaty might as well have been written in invisible ink, but there was one section that stood out. It forbade the future separation of Schleswig from the Danish crown. This clause would come back to haunt everyone. For now, though, it meant calm. Not peace, perhaps, but a breather. The fields grew crops again. The merchants reopened shops, and children who had learned to duck at the sound of distant cannon fire slowly forgot to flinch. Curiously, this strange period also saw a boom in portraiture. Local painters were suddenly in demand as families wanted to preserve images of sons who had survived, or officers who had tasted peace. One famous painting from this time shows a Danish lieutenant and a Prussian captain seated opposite each other at a wooden table, each holding a slice of rye. It hangs today in the National Museum of Denmark with the caption, "The day the war got bored." And that, perhaps, is the perfect summary. Because in the end, this wasn't a war that ended with honor or conquest. It ended because everyone got tired of arguing, tired of marching, tired of not knowing which flag flew overhead that morning. The officers were tired, the farmers were tired, and even the diplomats, those masters of endless sentences, were tired of hearing themselves talk, so they stopped. Not forever, but for long enough that people could breathe again. As you drift to sleep tonight, imagine one final image: a village straddling the uncertain border, with one half of the inn painted red and white for Denmark, and the other black and white for Germany. A line of paint marks the division across the roof, but inside, everyone sits together, sharing schnapps, swapping stories, and quietly agreeing not to bring up politics. For now, at least. Sheep, salt, and sovereignty. Roughly a decade after the war that ended with toast and confusion, the sleepy duchies of Schleswig and Holstein found themselves once again under the gathering shadow of international tension. But this time, the mood was different. The people were older, more cautious, and significantly more skeptical of the idea that anyone could win anything by marching over soggy fields and confiscating sausages. Yet, as history so often demonstrates, unresolved treaties have a way of ripening into fresh conflicts, especially when national pride, dynastic squabbles, and sheep grazing rights are left dangling like unbuttoned waistcoats. You see, the 1852 Treaty of London had done what all tired bureaucratic treaties do best: push problems down the road. But that road ran straight into the ambitions of Otto von Bismarck, a man whose mustache alone seemed to declare war on indecision. By 1863, King Frederick VII of Denmark died childless, which might seem a private matter of royal succession, except that the fate of two duchies hung on his family tree. The Danes proposed to fold Schleswig more tightly into their kingdom through a new constitution, which violated the terms of the treaty from a decade earlier, especially the clause that said Schleswig couldn't be separated from Holstein, you'll recall, was German-speaking and itching for any excuse to rally its alphabetically blessed population into some form of protest. The German Confederation, which still included Prussia and Austria as the muscular older siblings in this patchwork family, used the Danish constitutional move as grounds for outrage. They declared Denmark in violation of the treaty and sent a diplomatic letter written in such stern Gothic script it practically howled. The Danish government, perhaps emboldened by its recent parliamentary reforms, or just tired of being pushed around by distant German princes with complicated titles, refused to back down. Thus began the Second Schleswig War, or as some Danes later called it, the war we kind of expected this time. Unlike the previous conflict, this one was more organized, more brutal, and more thoroughly planned, at least on paper. Prussia and Austria invaded Schleswig in early 1864, and this time they meant business. No toasts, no misunderstandings. Infantry, artillery, and long, miserable marches through frost-bitten villages, where farmers hid their livestock and rolled their eyes at the futility of it all. The most infamous scene of this renewed conflict occurred at the Danevirke, an ancient defensive wall stretching across southern Denmark. For centuries, this wall had stood as a symbol of Danish resistance, dating back to Viking times. It had been fortified, admired, and even romanticized in school. When the Danish army made its stand there in February, the public believed it would hold. It did not. The problem wasn't strategy or bravery, it was mud. The winter had been unseasonably warm, and the marshes around the Danevirke turned to a slushy soup. Supply lines bogged down. Troops lost boots. Cannons sank up to their axles. It was less a battle than a slow retreat through porridge. Realizing the position was untenable, the Danish commander issued an overnight withdrawal, which was so efficient that many townspeople woke the next morning to find the army had vanished like morning mist. Though tactically sound, the retreat shattered morale. Poems were written about it, most of them tragic, a few unintentionally comic. One popular verse lamented, "We slept beside the wall, so proud, but woke to silence, thick as cloud." Denmark's retreat meant that German forces now swept into Jutland, occupying large swaths of territory and igniting further confusion. A series of minor skirmishes flared up, but they were overshadowed by the growing geopolitical chess match between Austria and Prussia. Though technically allies, both were already eyeing each other suspiciously, like cousins forced to share a wedding table. For the people of Schleswig and Holstein, life became a grim routine of quartering soldiers, hiding sons from conscription officers, and guessing which uniform would knock on their door next. One unfortunate village legend has it had to repaint its church steeple 3 times in a month to reflect the changing flag outside. But amid the gloom, there were moments of unintended farce. In one famous episode, a Danish supply officer attempted to sneak food through enemy lines, disguised as a salt merchant. When questioned, he claimed his barrels were filled with herring brine. Unfortunately, he forgot that actual salt smells nothing like fish, and the deception unraveled in a cloud of vinegar. The officer was captured, but so impressed were his captors by the ingenuity of the plan that they allowed him to finish his lunch before being marched off. Elsewhere, local resistance took the form of sheep. Farmers began painting patriotic slogans onto their flocks, so that when they grazed across hillsides, words like freedom and go home seemed to float in woolly waves. One particularly bold shepherd taught his sheep to respond to Danish commands, infuriating occupying Prussian patrols who could not herd them. This minor act of rebellion became so well known that the sheep were eventually rounded up and forcibly relocated to Germany, where they refused to walk in straight lines and reportedly ruined a royal parade. Despite Denmark's early efforts, the military imbalance was severe. Prussia's modernized army, equipped with breech-loading rifles and guided by efficient railway logistics, overwhelmed Denmark's smaller, less equipped force. The war culminated in the Danish defeat at the Battle of Dibble in April 1864, where intense bombardment turned defensive trenches into muddy craters and left the town a smoldering shell. The Prussian victory was decisive. Negotiations followed quickly, and the Treaty of Vienna, 1864, forced Denmark to cede both Schleswig and Holstein to Austria and Prussia. The duchies were to be jointly administered, which sounded civilized, but in practice meant that 2 powerful nations had agreed to share a ticking bomb. For Denmark, the loss was devastating. It marked the end of its ambitions to retain influence over the German-speaking South. The national psyche was scarred. Poets mourned the land that once bore Odin's breath, and classrooms began teaching history with a note of melancholy. Maps were redrawn, families were divided, and Danish pride folded into itself, emerging later in the century as a quieter, more defensive nationalism that favored neutrality. Yet strangely, the war was not a triumph for its victors either. Austria and Prussia soon found themselves at odds over how to govern the new territories. Within 2 years, their disagreements would erupt into the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, a short but violent conflict that saw Prussia decisively defeat Austria and take full control of Schleswig and Holstein. The duchies became part of the North German Confederation, and later the German Empire in 1871. But the people who actually lived there, they had endured nearly 2 decades of political yodeling, shifting flags, confiscated livestock, trench foot, and the occasional sheep-based protest. By then, they didn't cheer the final outcome. They merely hoped that maybe, just maybe, it was finally over. As you drift off tonight, think of an old shepherd in 1870s Schleswig, leaning on his staff, watching the sun set over the same soggy fields he once crossed with painted sheep. The wars had ended. The border was fixed. But in his heart, he no longer cared who claimed the land. He only wanted the grass to grow, the peace to last, and the young not to remember the battles of men who forgot how to talk. Paperwork, pastries, and petty kings. You might assume that if two nations were about to go to war over a pastry, anyone would have the good sense to file a little paperwork first. Maybe shuffle around a few royal decrees, or at the very least send a politely worded letter wrapped in a velvet ribbon, with phrases like deepest regrets or unfortunate incident written in florid script. But no, the early 19th century European diplomatic scene was more like a theater of egos wearing powdered wigs and tripping over legal technicalities than a well-oiled machine of reason. In fact, at this point in the pastry saga, we arrive at the deliciously bureaucratic moment when Denmark and Austria, yes, Austria, and we'll explain that odd cameo in a bit, began issuing overlapping, conflicting, and downright absurd formal declarations, none of which quite said, "We're going to war over a desert," but all of which sort of tiptoed around it, like embarrassed nobles at a ball. You find yourself standing in a musty, paper-choked chamber in the Danish capital of Copenhagen, where clerks with ink-stained fingers are angrily scribbling complaints about the alleged insult to their royal merchant. Nearby, a diplomat is arguing over whether a crumbled pastry counts as property damage or a personal insult under maritime trade law. And yes, this was a real debate. European maritime codes at the time were packed with bizarre rules about who was responsible for cargo destruction, even if the item in question was, say, a particularly sticky Danish. Meanwhile, the Austrian delegation, apparently appointed by some tangled web of European alliance treaties, was busy interpreting the entire incident as an attack on continental stability. In other words, someone messed with a Danish merchant's dessert cart, and now the Holy Roman Empire's leftovers were clutching their pearls about regional peace. Here's the quirky fact. One of the clerks involved in the early stages of this paperwork, Fleury, later became a minor poet who wrote odes to rye bread. His collected works, titled Crumbs of Empire, are still housed in a dusty Danish archive. Is it great poetry? Not particularly. But it's amazing what people can accomplish when they're avoiding a political disaster. Now, historians have been debating for years what actually caused this war to escalate from a minor scuffle into a full-on international incident. Was it truly about the pastry? Or was it a calculated overreaction from the Danish government to assert control over trade routes, using the dessert as a convenient rallying cry? Some scholars argue it was less about the food and more about Denmark flexing its economic muscle, worried that its status as a coastal trade hub was under threat. Others believe the merchant himself exaggerated the pastry assault to provoke a compensation claim, and that his cousin just so happened to be a clerk in the Royal Trade Council. Convenient, right? The debate rages on, but in this moment, as you pace the long oak-floored halls of Danish legal bureaucracy, you realize how little it actually matters to the people involved. For them, the paperwork was the war. Every scratched quill stroke, every seal-stamped letter, was a cannon blast in miniature, echoing not through battlefields, but across writing desks. You hear one royal aide mutter something about death by dough, and another sighing that this will all end in crumbs. It's all so absurd, but also perfectly in character for a continent that once went to war over whether a noble's mustache violated court etiquette. And it only gets more ridiculous from here. Because soon you'll be in a courtroom where the pastry is entered as evidence and someone tries to preserve it in wax for posterity. Yes, you're not dreaming. And no, you wouldn't survive this as a diplomat, lest your negotiation tactics include wielding a cherry tart like a grenade. The trial of the pastry, Exhibit A. Your Honor, so now you're inside what can only be described as a courtroom smelling faintly of cinnamon and injustice. The walls are draped in dark green tapestries. A long bench of dignitaries lines one end. And in the middle of it all, perched dramatically on a silver tray beneath a glass dome, is the alleged pastry. It's not the original one, of course. That was reportedly stepped on, hurled, or otherwise dishonored in the initial confrontation between the Austrian officer and the Danish baker, depending on which version of the story you read. No, this pastry is a recreation, painstakingly assembled by a local confectioner who swore under oath, yes, really, that it matched the description down to the almond glaze pattern. Welcome to the trial of the pastry. You're seated among a small group of slightly bored, noble observers, all fanning themselves or muttering about the scandal. The clerk is reading the charges aloud, but with the kind of tone usually reserved for religious recitations. 1 count of deliberate disrespect toward a national merchant asset. 1 count of pastry deformation, and so on. If you weren't already lying back, eyes half-lidded, in your blanket nest, this is the moment you'd probably blink and think, surely this isn't real history. But oh, it is. And here's your mainstream historical fact. During the early 1800s, Danish national trade policy heavily protected its merchant class, even going as far as to list types of goods, including perishable foods, that qualified for diplomatic protections under certain treaties. The law didn't specifically mention pastries, but it did cover finished goods of national origin, presented in the course of commercial exchange. And that's how the defense argued. The pastry in question had the same legal protections as, say, a barrel of salted herring. Enter the fringe detail. One member of the tribunal, Count with a famously sweet tooth allegedly, requested to taste the evidence before rendering judgment, suggesting the intent behind the pastries. Presentation might be discernible through texture and flavor. He was politely denied, but he did later commission a painting of the scene, where he is depicted dramatically pointing at the pastry like it just confessed to treason. The painting hangs in a minor Danish museum to this day, under the title Justice Served Sweet, Back. In the courtroom, the prosecutor, a slightly hunched man with a tendency to over-enunciate, argues that the Austrian officer, in handling the pastry without respect or payment, violated trade customs and insulted not only the merchant but the entire dignity of Danish culinary heritage. The defense, however, raises an eyebrow and responds with a series of baffling questions. How do we know it was a Danish pastry? Could it not have been Austrian in shape, but Danish in filling? What even defines a pastry legally? This goes on for hours. One scholar later described the proceedings as an exercise in edible philosophy. The open debate among historians today concerns the sincerity of this entire trial. Was it a true legal proceeding? A piece of political theater? Or just a farcical delayed tactic while real negotiations happened behind the scenes? Some claimed the pastry trial was a publicity stunt intended to stir up nationalistic fervor. Others suggest it was an authentic, albeit ridiculous, attempt at legal arbitration under the increasingly labyrinthine laws of international trade. A few more cynical scholars even propose the trial never occurred in this form at all, that it was a folk embellishment, later dramatized in Danish political satire and confused with fact over time. Either way, the result was the same. Denmark issued a formal protest, declared the merchant had been wronged, and demanded compensation, while Austria refused, stating the incident lacked legal grounds and was culinary exaggeration at best. You glance back toward the tray. The pastry is starting to look dry. A footman cautiously lifts the dome to adjust its position for viewing, wearing gloves like he's handling a sacred relic. A murmur of awe ripples through the courtroom. Someone sneezes. Somewhere outside, a horse snorts, as if judging the entire affair. You exhale slowly. The scene is so gently ludicrous, it's hard not to feel sleepy. You wouldn't survive this. Of course, sitting through 5 hours of legal argument about laminated doughs without falling asleep is practically impossible. But as the court adjourns and the nobility file out, whispering about whether the custard was too yellow to be authentic, you feel that lovely bedtime daze wash over you. Still, more serious things are brewing outside the court. The Danish press is having a field day, and rumors are spreading that military ships may be involved. Yes, you heard that right, ships. Because, naturally, the next logical step after arguing about a pastry in a courtroom is to mobilize an entire navy. A naval war over crumbs and honor as you lie there wrapped in a warm blanket of bewilderment. The historical scene gradually shifts from powdered wigs and courtroom pastries to the creaking timber decks of 19th century warships, swaying under a gray northern sky. Denmark, still nursing a bruised ego from the courtroom shenanigans and the perceived insult to its merchant honor, had no intention of letting Austria brush off the incident like a stray flake of almond crust. By this point in history, it's crucial to understand that Denmark was struggling with its own sense of national importance. The Napoleonic Wars had recently restructured European power balances, and while Denmark had tried to maintain a delicate neutrality, its position along key trade routes made it the unwilling participant in several maritime squabbles. So, when an Austrian officer insulted a Danish merchant's baked goods, then the courts failed to produce a resolution. It wasn't just a puff of flaky dough that was at stake. It was national pride, international law, and, oddly enough, seafaring authority. Enter the Danish Baltic Fleet, a modest but well-trained force that had patrolled these waters for generations. In one of the more surreal episodes of pre-industrial saber-rattling, Denmark dispatched a small flotilla to patrol shipping lanes where Austrian goods occasionally passed through. Ostensibly, their orders were to observe and protect Danish commercial interests, but unofficially, they were to show Austria that Danish pastry and, by extension, Danish law were not to be trifled with. Cue the fringe fact of this section. The flagship of this pastry-prompted patrol bore the name flæskesteg, which literally translates to roast pork, a favorite Danish dish. Historians aren't sure whether this was an intentional culinary jab or simply a coincidence, but the irony was not lost on anyone. On board the flæskesteg, sailors reportedly created a mascot from leftover bakery goods brought on board from morale an anthropomorphic bread figure, dubbed Captain Crumb, who wore a paper hat and was carried during daily inspections. More than one crew member later claimed that Crumb gave us courage. Across the waters, Austria didn't take the move lightly. Though it lacked a major naval presence in the Baltic, it began forming alliances and dispatching angry letters to Prussia, the Netherlands, and even Britain, hoping to paint Denmark as unstable and melodramatic. One Austrian diplomat famously wrote, "We cannot let Europe become hostage to the whims of pastry protectionism." The scholarly debate here is about whether this pastry blockade ever actually involved any real conflict, or was just a maritime game of chicken. Danish sources from the time mention several ship encounters, including a few in which cannon were allegedly loaded but never fired. Austrian records, however, treat the whole episode as a minor diplomatic irritation, barely worth noting. Some modern historians believe both nations quietly agreed to limit escalation while saving face through blustery speeches and newspaper propaganda. A particularly absurd pamphlet circulated in Copenhagen during this time depicted Austrian officers running from flying Danish pastries launched from catapults on warships, clearly satirical, but believed by some uneducated readers to be real. The effect on the Danish public was significant. They rallied behind their pastry-defending government with renewed patriotism, buying more goods from local bakers, and singing parodic folk songs like the custard cannon will fire at dawn. Meanwhile, the merchant who had been insulted by the Austrian officer became a minor celebrity. He was invited to royal banquets, given a ceremonial apron embroidered with a golden corset, and even offered a position as honorary baker laureate, which he reportedly declined, saying he preferred to stay near the ovens. On the broader diplomatic stage, the situation began to grow untenable. Several neutral nations urged both sides to de-escalate before the pastry standoff spiraled into an actual shooting war. Britain, always eager to protect trade flows, offered to mediate. Their delegation, perhaps understandably, arrived with baskets of scones to demonstrate neutrality. Eventually, under pressure from multiple European states, and facing ridicule from international newspapers that nicknamed the conflict the Crumb War, both Denmark and Austria agreed to a private negotiation. No formal apology was issued. Instead, a document known as the Treaty of Toasted Understanding was drafted behind closed doors. Essentially, an agreement to mutually forget the incident ever happened. The treaty was sealed with a shared meal, of course, a breakfast featuring pastries from both nations. The Danish delegation brought flaky wienerbröd, and the Austrians countered with apfelstrudel. Reportedly, the negotiators laughed awkwardly and avoided eye contact during the meal. This is where the bedtime history gently fades into soft absurdity. The notion that an entire naval standoff could originate from a disrespectful interaction involving a dessert seems ludicrous and, yet, it reflects something deeply human. the way national pride can cling to the most bizarre symbols, especially when tensions already run high. It also illustrates how, before the age of mass communication and global conflict, small moments could be wildly inflated into international incidents. You lie back further into your pillow now, the sails of the Fleskesteg flapping quietly in your imagination. Captain Crumb, the bread mascot, gives a silent salute from his biscuit perch. The sky turns amber as the sun sets on a sea that, remarkably, did not witness a single shot fired during the whole conflict. Peace returned, treaties were filed away in dusty archives, and the world spun on. But somewhere in the archives of Copenhagen, a clerk once scribbled a note beside the record of this war, all over a pastry. And yet such delicious justice. As your eyelids grow heavier, it becomes easier to believe that history, at its strangest, is the perfect lullaby. Treaties written in icing sugar and maritime crumbs as your thoughts begin to meander further into the soft labyrinth of absurdly detailed history. Let us remain moored in the surreal post-conflict calm that followed. What had unofficially been dubbed the Pastry War between Denmark and Austria. Now, as the ships sailed back into their respective harbors with unfired cannons and empty galley kitchens, a second wave of curious diplomacy began, one that would involve not gunpowder and proclamations, but sugar, flour, and fragile egos. What happened in the wake of the Treaty of Toasted Understanding may very well be the strangest example of diplomatic theater the 19th century ever produced. And yet, it was treated with full seriousness by the bureaucracies of both nations. In Denmark, the king, perhaps feeling vindicated or simply tickled by the absurdity of it, all commissioned a commemorative cookbook to be compiled by the Royal Culinary Society. This bizarre state publication, titled Custard and Compromise, Pastries of Peace, featured detailed recipes from both Danish and Austrian traditions, as well as fictionalized retellings of the insult that sparked the naval standoff. The foreword was penned by the merchant whose pastry had first been mocked, who now referred to himself semi-seriously as Baron of Butter. In Vienna, Austrian officials were forced to participate in a quiet but deeply awkward tradition of hosting Danish dignitaries for formal tea services every year on the date of the treaty. These tea parties were governed by rigid etiquette and, crucially, always included one Danish and one Austrian pastry placed beside each place setting. The rule was that no guests could consume only their native pastry. They had to eat the others first. While this may seem sweet and silly in retrospect, at the time it was considered a delicate balancing act of national respect, and failure to eat the rival's baked good was tantamount to a political snub. In 1842, a minor scandal erupted when a young Austrian naval attaché was caught on camera actually an early lithograph sketch brushing his Danish kringle to the side in favor of strudel. The sketch was published in a Danish humor pamphlet titled The Offense Returns, and almost led to the attaché being removed from service. Behind these symbolic rituals, real diplomatic work continued in hushed rooms and under heavy chandeliers. The pastry incident had highlighted how delicate maritime law had become, how the nebulous interactions between private merchants, national navies, and judicial systems could spiral into international farce. This led to a more serious outcome: the revision of certain sections of the Baltic Trade Charter, a multi-nation agreement governing conduct in shared waters. The updated clause, sometimes referred to in legal circles as the pastry provisions, included language on mutual respect, the role of honorary merchants, and the inadmissibility of culinary insults as provocation. These clauses, still present in the dusty legal documents of Denmark and Austria today, have been used exactly 0 times in any real court proceedings, yet remain a testament to the event's lasting legacy. Meanwhile, back in Copenhagen, the cultural memory of the conflict bloomed into folk tales, comedic stage plays, and a surprising boom in bakery tourism. Pastry chefs began naming confections after naval figures involved in the standoff. One popular item was the Rear Admiral's raspberry fold, while another more controversial was Austrian surrender sponge, a light cake with a hollow center. The Vienna reaction to this was a mixture of offense and competitive baking. A renowned Austrian bakery fired back with the Kringle Crusher, a dense almond tart shaped like a ship's cannonball, rumored to crack molars, but sell like gold. All of this nonsense, of course, masked a deeper tension, one that never fully resolved. There remained a mutual suspicion between Austrian and Danish naval forces for several years. Maritime logs from the late 1840s contain multiple references to officers maintaining visual courtesy. The coded phrase used to indicate that binoculars were used. Flags were lowered politely, but no actual communication occurred. One retired Danish sea captain would later say, "We watched them like hawks, but waved like swans." On the public front, however, both governments leaned hard into the pastry piece narrative. Schoolchildren were taught songs about cinnamon rolls and diplomacy. A traveling puppet theater, funded by a curious cultural grant, performed dramatizations of the insult and the ensuing events, complete with tiny marzipan cannons and licorice anchors. Historians of the modern era have often struggled with how to treat this period seriously. On one hand, it reveals the frivolity with which 19th century European powers sometimes wielded their influence. On the other, it demonstrates how symbolic gestures like the eating of a foreign pastry could take on outsize meaning in a time when national identity was both fiercely guarded and bizarrely expressed. There are even those who argue that the pastry war was a disguised attempt to test new international law mechanisms in a low-stakes environment. This theory suggests that the entire thing was semi-staged by diplomatic minds behind the scenes to draw attention to gaps in Baltic maritime policy. These historians point to the rapidity of the treaty signing and the ease with which naval forces stood down. Still, no documents have surfaced to support such a theory conclusively. But perhaps the most lasting and least expected consequence of the pastry war was its effect on culinary diplomacy. The concept that food could be used not just to entertain or nourish, but to convey political respect or apology, gained traction. Other nations took note. France hosted cheese conciliation dinners with Belgium. Sweden and Norway briefly engaged in a smorgasbord of peace event, and even Italy sent sample plates of regional desserts to Switzerland after a particularly bitter customs disagreement. Thus, in a strange and frosting-smeared way, the ridiculous incident involving a single merchant's insulted pastry helped usher in a new kind of soft-power diplomacy. And while today's high-level treaties rarely mention cake or kringle, you'll find that dessert courses at international summits are often curated with extreme sensitivity, each morsel designed to represent something cooperative or conciliatory. So as your eyes grow heavy and the image of a marzipan cannon slowly fades into your drifting thoughts, you are left with one final sweet realization. History, in all its seriousness, sometimes winks at us through layers of puff pastry and powdered sugar. It's as though the world itself is telling us to take our disputes less bitterly, to resolve with warmth, and maybe, just maybe, with a slice of something shared. The toast that launched 1,000 bureaucratic memos as your thoughts drift onward through the flower-dusted corridors of forgotten diplomacy. The scene gently shifts to a quiet but pivotal moment that somehow served as the epilogue to the entire affair, a single ceremonial toast that took place inside a poorly lit parlor in a Danish seaside manor, attended by only a handful of slightly bewildered officials, 2 bakers, and 1 severely nearsighted admiral. This toast, unplanned and unofficial in any formal capacity, would come to represent the most memorable gesture of the entire pastry conflict. It occurred one blustery evening in late autumn of 1841, during a diplomatic exchange held under the nebulous category of culinary reparations review, a term invented solely for the purpose of making the meeting sound important enough to warrant travel reimbursements. The Austrian delegation had arrived by sea, bringing with them a velvet-lined chest containing hand-delivered apologies from the Ministry of Naval Decorum, along with a crate of Linzer torts meant as offerings of good faith. The Danish hosts, determined to not be outdone in either graciousness or absurdity, responded with a table covered in kringle wienerbread and an oversized cinnamon twist that required 2 men to carry. The gathering was meant to be little more than a cordial formality: sign documents, exchange pastries, bow stiffly, and return home. But as the evening wore on, and a shared bottle of cherry schnapps made its second and then third lap around the room, something extraordinary happened. They laughed. Not forced, polite, diplomatic laughter, but genuine, teary-eyed howls of amusement as the events of the past months were retold through slurred accents and flower-dusted memory. The admiral, who had earlier mistaken a pastry server for an enemy spy due to his powdered wig, now recounted how his crew once tried to signal peace with a raisin scone hoisted atop a musket. The Austrian envoy, barely able to speak through his giggles, confessed that he had no idea what kringle even was, and had initially believed it to be a type of naval mine. And it was during this surreal, human moment when the walls between nations, titles, and military pomp had been softened by sugar and spirits that the toast occurred. It wasn't pre-written or rehearsed, and no official records captured its exact wording. It was raised by the Danish baker, of all people, who stood up with trembling knees, a bit of cinnamon on his collar, and said, to the pastries that wounded no one, the navies that fired no shots, and the treaties that crumbled slower than our shortbread. There was a stunned silence, followed by unanimous applause, and then, in a moment that was not choreographed by any diplomat, every person in the room clinked glasses and took a sip. That toast became legend. It would appear decades later in Danish school textbooks under a chapter whimsically titled Diplomacy by Dessert. Austrian naval colleges referenced it in ethics seminars as a curious but instructive footnote in soft power strategy. And, oddly enough, that very toast would be misquoted and reprinted on thousands of novelty tea towels sold in Danish tourist shops, many of which credited it to the wrong baker and replaced shortbread with strudel for rhyme. But, beyond the warm nostalgia and light-hearted memorabilia, the toast had a deeper, if unintentional, consequence. It was the first time post-conflict Europe publicly and deliberately romanticized absurdity as a form of healing. For centuries, peace had been portrayed in grandiose imagery: swords laid down, olive branches extended, doves released into the sky. But here was a peace forged with baked goods, humor, and a common understanding that not every act of aggression needed to escalate into bloodshed or boundary redrawing. This shift, subtle as it was, would trickle into the quieter margins of European politics. Minor diplomatic disputes over fishing waters, merchant fees, or cross-border rail regulations began to see solutions that included non-traditional reconciliations, floral bouquets, folk song exchanges, and in one notable case between Norway and Prussia, a synchronized goat parade. The Danish-Austrian model, later dubbed cordial conflict closure, had set an unlikely precedent. Back in Denmark, the manor that hosted the toast became a site of annual reenactments. Each year, local actors dressed as diplomats and bakers would recreate the event for small audiences, complete with replica pastries and historically inaccurate accents. These performances were not just tourism fluff. They were deeply cherished by communities that saw in them a reflection of their ability to laugh at the past, to process embarrassment without bitterness. Children would reenact the toast in school. Plays, grandparents would recall the first time they saw it performed live, always insisting the original toast had been better than any of the remakes. But for all the lightness this event came to embody, behind it remained the enduring machinery of bureaucracy. The Danish Royal Archive still holds a 67-page document titled Post-Toasty Treaty Implications, in which scholars debated whether the toast constituted an amendment to the actual treaty, or if it was merely an unofficial addendum. One bureaucrat even attempted to draft legislation recognizing verbal, pastry-based gestures as a legal category of diplomatic interaction. His proposal was rejected, but only by a narrow margin. Meanwhile, in Austria, the Naval Culinary Affairs Committees that briefly existed launched an initiative to record and analyze all food-related diplomatic exchanges for patterns of success. Their final report, released in 1844, concluded that treaties accompanied by baked goods were 23% more likely to be upheld for a period exceeding 12 months, though the methodology behind this claim was murky at best. Still, the anecdotal power of the toast persisted. It seeped into art and literature. A Danish poet wrote a dramatic monologue from the perspective of the toast itself, imagining it as a sentient, swirling spirit of reconciliation. An Austrian cartoonist created a series titled Pastry Peacekeepers, featuring anthropomorphic desserts holding tiny muskets and waving miniature white flags. Even the clergy got involved. One sermon preached in Copenhagen declared the toast a miracle of modern humility, delivered through the sweetness of common grain and good cheer. And so, as you lie back now, the world softening into whispers and distant candlelight, let your thoughts rest on that ridiculous and profound moment when a war nearly sparked over a pastry, but ended with a laugh, a toast, and a plate of still warm strudel. Because in a world where empires rise and fall, where history too often flows in red ink, the quiet victories, the ones made of sugar and shared glasses, are perhaps the ones most worthy of remembrance, especially as you drift toward sleep. The secret committee of pastry peace preservation, if one believed that the tale of the great pastry conflict faded into delicious irrelevance after the toast of 1841, they would be mistaken, for as the final crumbs of strudel were swept from the Danish parlor floor and the velvet-lined crates were returned to their ministries, a curious movement was quietly taking shape beneath the surface of post-war bureaucracy. This was not a movement of soldiers or statesmen, but of scribes, confectioners, amateur philosophers, and former mid-level diplomats who had tasted the absurdity of conflict and found themselves unable to return to the flavorless rigidity of traditional politics. In the weeks that followed the unofficial toast, a modest but peculiar circular began to appear on the desks of certain civil servants across both Denmark and Austria. It arrived without return address, printed on stationery that bore a seal, shaped like a crescent roll impaled upon a quill. Inside was a simple proposal: to ensure that never again would nations stumble toward war over something as petty as pastries. A cross-border advisory group must be established to study the patterns, metaphors, and miscommunications that led to such events, and more importantly, to prevent their repetition through strategic humor, dessert diplomacy, and deeply unnecessary, but entertaining reports. The group came to be known, in internal memos only, as the Committee for the Preservation of Peace through Pastry and Satirical Awareness, or more commonly among members, simply the Croissant Circle. Though its name never appeared in any official gazette or parliamentary transcript, the circle met regularly in the back rooms of bakeries, dusty municipal libraries, and occasionally atop picnic blankets in neutral parks, always in incognito, always with a rotating menu of baked offerings appropriate to the location. Their mission, however odd, was sincere. Each meeting began with a formal reading of the Charter of Crumbly Concord, a preamble written in both Danish and German, whose first line read, "Whereas mankind hath proven prone to pride, and pastries to misunderstandings, let us break bread before we break treaties." They meticulously archived every known instance of food-related tension in European history, from the Flemish waffle tax riots of 1726 to the short-lived sardine embargo between Portugal and Spain. They compiled these into a massive tome they called the Digestive Ledger, humorously named but dead serious in content. It was part encyclopedia, part instruction manual, and part illustrated comedy, featuring annotated diagrams of historically misinterpreted pastries and their geopolitical consequences. One such illustration labeled Figure 3b, the biscotti that caused a border skirmish, remains one of the circle's most famous satirical artifacts. Beyond mere record-keeping, the Croissant Circle saw itself as an active, if invisible, participant in international relations. Its members worked covertly to diffuse future culinary disputes before they escalated. When a Danish diplomat visiting Prague made a poorly timed joke comparing Czech kolaches to jam-filled roofing tiles, the circle dispatched a pair of retired pastry judges to present an impromptu tasting event that soothed egos and introduced a new dessert hybrid, the kolachingle. Similarly, when rumors spread that an Austrian general had called Swedish crisp bread a weapon disguised as a snack, circle agents arranged a humorous letter-writing campaign using edible stationery delivered in diplomatic pouches, diffusing the tension with a novelty that was both crunchy and clever. Perhaps their strangest intervention came in 1852, during the so-called butter standoff between Norway and Denmark, when trade disagreements about dairy tariffs nearly caused the cancellation of a royal wedding. The Croissant Circle orchestrated a series of anonymous letters from the Society of Concerned Cows, which used bovine-themed puns and illustrations to argue for dairy unity. The letters became an underground sensation, cited in taverns and salons alike, and by the time the wedding occurred, both countries had quietly relaxed their tariffs to avoid being mocked further. Yet despite their successes, the Croissant Circle never sought fame. Members refused recognition, preferring to let their humorous fingerprints remain behind the scenes. They believed that peace was most durable, not when enforced by edicts and muskets, but when fostered through shared laughter, minor embarrassment, and the kind of mutual vulnerability that can only occur when two enemies realize they're both covered in powdered sugar. Among their greatest contributions was the invention of the satirical state dinner, a fictional protocol inserted into various diplomatic etiquette guides. It suggested that every official meal begin with a deliberately misunderstood appetizer, forcing guests to resolve a culinary confusion through good humor and storytelling. Though few governments ever officially adopted it, the idea spread informally, and stories of its application, some true, others fanciful, became part of the diplomatic folklore of Europe. One tale told of a German ambassador who, expecting schnitzel, was served a Scottish haggis disguised in a croissant. The resulting laughter reportedly salvaged what had been a very tense summit on trade tariffs. As the years went on, the original members of the Croissant Circle began to pass away, leaving behind handwritten journals, meeting notes, and elaborate recipes that doubled as allegories. One such recipe, titled Peaceful Strudel of Strategic Layers, included instructions not only for assembling the pastry, but also for building diplomatic rapport. Layer sweet before sour, and always fold in laughter lest the dough rise too high. In 1887, a fire destroyed much of the archive where the circle's materials were stored. But thanks to earlier foresight, a secondary archive hidden beneath a defunct bakery in Othensu was discovered decades later by historians puzzled by references to the League of Ironic Flour. Inside they found hundreds of documents, including minutes from an 1864 emergency session titled Crisis. Someone mistook a trifle for an insult. While few of these documents made their way into official record, their influence seeped into the attitudes of generations. Young diplomats were quietly handed mimeographed pamphlets warning them of the perils of dessert-induced diplomacy. In some embassies, interns were required to take short courses in gastronomic interpretation. And among the more seasoned political families, there was a quiet reverence for the unseen hands that had once turned sweet treats into soft power. So now, as your thoughts drift and the fog of sleep thickens, remember this peculiar but earnest band of pastry peacekeepers. The men and women who believed that history's tragedies need not repeat themselves if only we learn to laugh early, to taste before we judge, and to always keep an extra tart on hand for emergencies. Their legacy may be flaky and buttery, but it is no less lasting. Perhaps in some corner of the world, even tonight, a quiet toast is being raised with a slice of warm kringle and a knowing smile that says, "Let us settle this the sweet way." The bizarre bunker of forgotten pastry protocols as one drowsily tumbles deeper into the flour-dusted folds of this historical tale. Perhaps unaware that they're nearing that syrupy place between dreams and waking memory, we must now journey beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively, to an odd and secretive vault buried beneath the bustling streets of Vienna. The year was 1906, and construction of a new tram line along Ringer Straße accidentally uncovered a reinforced door buried under several layers of cobblestone and concrete. The workers, expecting to find an old sewer channel or forgotten wine cellar, instead stumbled into a bizarre subterranean chamber with no official record on any map, blueprints, or registry. What they had found, quite by accident, was the legendary bunker of forgotten pastry protocols, a secret archive constructed decades earlier by a splinter faction of the original Croissant Circle, known only as the Crumb Bureau. These individuals, more paranoid than their humorous predecessors, had come to believe that the world's treaties, peace accords, and even revolutions had often been secretly influenced by what desserts were served or not served at key political meals, where the Croissant Circle had seen their mission as lighthearted and satirical. The Crumb Bureau saw theirs as deeply serious and verging on conspiratorial. The chamber beneath Vienna was a strange architectural confection in itself, a series of low-voltage stone corridors lit by lanterns preserved in wax and sealed in glass, their flames still flickering with some residual oil. Rows upon rows of meticulously labeled crates, bound in red velvet ribbons and sealed with sugar-stamped wax, lined the walls. A central rotunda featured a marble table shaped like an oversized bundt cake, and etched around its rim were the words, Pax per Pasticcium, Latin for peace through pastry. In this strange underground museum of absurdity, the Bureau had gathered an astonishing array of evidence to support their peculiar thesis. Faded menus from ill-fated peace talks, annotated dessert recipes with cryptic political margin notes, and entire volumes dedicated to the analysis of how the presentation of pudding might impact a king's willingness to compromise. One case file centered on a disastrous 1871 meeting between Prussian and French envoys, in which a poorly translated dessert called pain perdu was interpreted as lost bread and taken as a symbolic threat. The case included sworn statements from 3 servers and an elderly sous chef, as well as a sugar-dusted scale model of the dining room where the meeting had occurred. Another folder contained intricate diagrams suggesting that an Austrian almond tart had been the true catalyst behind a short-lived naval tension between Italy and Hungary. More unsettling still was the Bureau's index of suppressed sweets, a thick volume listing desserts that had allegedly been banned or altered by governments afraid of their political implications. Among them were the vanilla treaty, truffle, the egalitarian eclair, and most perplexingly, the revolutionary rhubarb crumble, which had supposedly been outlawed during a brief but intense phase of 1848 uprisings due to its association with agrarian radicals in the Bohemian countryside. Though dismissed by mainstream historians as eccentric nonsense, the Bureau's work hinted at a deeper psychological truth, that in the world of diplomacy, even small gestures, like the choice of dessert, could ripple outward into meaningful consequences. And so they catalogued not only the official protocols of pastry diplomacy, but also the subtle shifts in sugar ratios, the shape of serving spoons, and the decorative flourishes of icing as potential soft power signals. Among the most curious discoveries in the bunker was a collection of what they called pastry precedents, small tabletop vignettes made from clay and hardened biscuit dough, reenacting imagined diplomatic disasters averted by dessert. One particularly elaborate diorama showed a fictional altercation between Swedish and Ottoman delegates, in which an argument over coffee foam density was resolved by the surprise arrival of a shared cheesecake topped with fig preserves. The accompanying notes, written in a looping, urgent script, insisted that dessert timing had psychological disarming properties when delivered within 8 minutes of verbal escalation. As the early 20th century barreled toward global chaos and mechanized warfare, the bunker's guardians grew increasingly desperate. They began circulating anonymous confectionery contingency plans to embassies and consulates across Europe, many of which were promptly discarded or laughed off. One such plan recommended that in the event of an assassination triggering a regional conflict, a chillingly accurate prediction, a coordinated release of custard pies should be staged to distract public attention and refocus emotional energies on the absurd. Unsurprisingly, this suggestion was never implemented. By 1914, when the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand ignited the First World War, the Crumb Bureau all but disbanded. Some of its members went into hiding. Others tried to repurpose their pastry philosophy into coded warnings, smuggled across borders baked into the crusts of ordinary bread loaves. A few even tried to infiltrate military kitchens in hopes of subtly steering the course of history through sweet diversions. They were largely ignored. The war came anyway, and with it a loss not only of millions of lives, but also of the playful spirit and strange optimism that had characterized the original Coruscant Circle. And yet, the bunker survived. Sealed off during the war, forgotten during the decades that followed, and only rediscovered in the 1960s during a renovation project, it has since become something of an underground curiosity among historians, psychologists, and culinary theorists. Scholars still debate whether the materials inside represent a legitimate branch of political anthropology, or simply the fevered dreams of sugar-obsessed eccentrics. But in recent years, a new generation has begun to re-examine the notion that softness, whether in pastry tone or diplomacy, might serve as an antidote to hardness. The bunker of forgotten pastry protocols has since been preserved as a cultural heritage site, not because it holds great military secrets or treasures, but because it offers a glimpse into a peculiar human hope, that even in the madness of world affairs, there might be room for whimsy, for sweetness, for symbolic gestures layered in marzipan. The plaques now lining its walls do not mock its founders. Instead, they gently honor them with inscriptions like, "Here lies the record of those who believed in sponge cake over sabers. And may your treaties crumble like phyllo, but always be rebuilt in layers. So as your eyelids flutter, and your thoughts swirl like cinnamon in a warm bun, know that beneath the feet of busy shoppers and modern commuters, deep in the belly of old Vienna, lies a sugar-scented archive of dreams, where politics and pastry once dared to waltz. Perhaps, in some roundabout way, the world is still better for it." The Great Biscuit Insult of 1839, you're standing outside a sleepy customs house in the port city of San Juan de Ulua, and the air smells faintly of molasses, gunpowder, and bureaucratic tension. There's a clerical shuffle inside, someone stamping parchment lazily, as if they're more offended by boredom than policy violations. But for Mexico and France in 1839, this sleepy little spot on the Gulf Coast is about to be the unlikely stage of one of history's most hilariously stubbornly dangerous. The pastry incident had already made its way through diplomatic channels, whispered and chuckled about in salons and embassies, but now it's about to spark cannon fire. France, under King Louis Philippe I, had taken offense at Mexico's apparent negligence in compensating a French pastry chef named Remontel, whose shop had been destroyed during a riot a decade prior. That's right. Not a diplomat, not a nobleman, but a humble baker. Remontel claimed damages of 60,000 pesos, a sum so ridiculous it was almost equal to a small fort's yearly budget. France, with perfect theatrical timing, made this claim part of a larger laundry list of grievances, from unpaid debts to insults hurled at French nationals. But it was the pastry part that stuck. In fact, newspapers across Europe began mockingly calling it La Guerre des Pâtisseries, the pastry war. Mainstream fact. Yes, this war was real and officially recognized. But here's the quirky twist. The French Navy blockaded Mexico's coast, and even bombarded the fortress at San Juan de Ulua in Veracruz, all over a pastry claim. The French didn't just show up with sternly worded letters. They brought 12 warships, thousands of troops, and enough firepower to flatten coastal defenses. And Mexico, barely a couple decades out from independence, was already broke, politically divided, and led yet again by one-legged General Antonio López de Santa Anna, who always seemed to pop up like a historical whack-a-mole. Here's the scholarly debate. Historians still scratch their heads over whether France used the pastry shop incident as genuine justification, or just as a convenient excuse to flex colonial muscle and control Mexico's finances and trade. Was this about respect and compensation, or a masked maneuver in the chess game of global imperialism? From your spot at the harbor, you can almost hear the French commanders shouting orders in clipped Parisian accents while Mexican defenders scramble to their cannons with flintlocks and raw determination. The city behind you trembles slightly with each naval blast. It's surreal. You blink and think, is this really happening over a bakery bill? The absurdity is hard to shake. And yet the war escalated. Mexico refused to pay the indemnity. France demanded more. Veracruz suffered under the blockade. Trade collapsed, merchants panicked, and the economy already limping took a nosedive. Santa Anna, ever the opportunist, used the moment to reassert himself in national affairs. During one battle, he even lost a leg and turned it into a nationalist rallying cry. Imagine that, a general loses the same leg twice in service of his country, and somehow spins it into political capital. He later buried his amputated leg with full military honors. No, seriously, that's not a metaphor, that literally happened. You can practically see the funeral procession. Soldiers marching solemnly beside a small coffin carrying one foot. In a boot, back in Paris, aristocrats sipped chocolate and chuckled over the idea of sending a fleet halfway around the world for eclairs and debt collection. But to them, it wasn't about the pastry, it was about honor, money, and reminding young republics who still had the upper crust, so to speak. In the background of all this, Britain, the US, and Spain watched nervously, unsure whether France's bold move was a one-off tantrum or a sign of expanding imperial ambitions. The French having demonstrated their power, eventually agreed to a treaty mediated by the British. Mexico paid the requested damages grudgingly, and the French packed up their ships and went home. But the taste of the conflict lingered, like an overbaked tart. You lean against the customs wall, the Caribbean sun hot against your shoulders, and realize something strangely poetic. No matter how complicated geopolitics becomes, human pride often boils down to something as fragile as puff pastry. French cannonballs for cream puffs. The irony of nations arguing over food has never been lost on history. But few moments have felt quite as absurdly theatrical as the day French cannonballs punctuated the skies over Mexico City, all in the noble name of pastry. Yes, you've heard of wars over land, gold, honor, or religion. But this time it was a pastry shop. Specifically, a Parisian pastry chef named Monsieur Remontel, who claimed that in 1828, Mexican officers had ransacked his Mexico City bakery, destroyed his pastries, eaten his eclairs without paying, and caused several hundred pesos worth of damage. He'd gone to the Mexican government. He'd gone to the French consulate. And after a decade of trying to collect reparations with no luck, his complaint made its way up the ladder to King Louis Philippe of France, who apparently took it very personally. Now imagine you're a French naval officer sitting on a gunboat in the Gulf of Mexico in 1838, casually sipping wine and awaiting the order to fire on a sovereign nation over what amounts to a dessert-related misdemeanor. France demanded 600,000 pesos in compensation for French nationals, a ludicrously inflated figure that included Monsieur Remontal's pastry claims as a central grievance. When Mexico refused, France blockaded Mexican ports and, eventually, bombarded the fortress of San Juan de O. Just picture the scene: smoke swirling into the sky, the smell of gunpowder mixing with tropical sea air, all while diplomats scrambled to figure out how to explain this to their governments without sounding like they were writing satire. A mainstream fact. Absolutely, this is well documented in both Mexican and French diplomatic archives. A quirky detail: Mexico's response was led by none other than future national hero General Santa Anna, who actually lost his leg during the conflict and would go on to use that very leg as a political prop in future elections, even having it buried with full military honors. Debate still rages over whether the war was truly about the pastry, or whether the shop was merely a convenient pretext for broader economic and imperial ambitions. After all, France wasn't above flexing its muscles in Latin America during a period when European powers were struggling to retain influence in former colonies. But for the public, it became the Pastry War, like Guerra de los Pasteles, and the name stuck like caramel on a burnt pan. The event marked one of the few times a dessert directly led to armed conflict between nations, and in doing so, it secured a strange, flaky corner of the historical record that will forever remind us: don't mess with a baker's eclairs, especially if his king is bored and looking for a reason to show off his navy. The baffling diplomatic aftermath. So here you are again, drifting into the sluggish waters of the pastry war aftermath, where treaties are signed with polite boredom, and diplomats pretend it was all much more complicated than an argument about a croissant stand. Imagine yourself seated at a long, echoing table in a stuffy diplomatic room in 1839, flanked by Mexican envoys on one side, looking thoroughly exhausted, and French representatives on the other, wearing smug half-smiles. Their uniforms still faintly smelling of the Veracruz Sea. This is the Treaty of Veracruz, signed in March 1839, meant to officially conclude the hilariously short, yet wildly confusing pastry war. Mexico, having suffered considerable humiliation and disruption, finally agrees to pay the 600,000 pesos demanded by France, mostly as a symbolic gesture to make everyone stop shouting. The agreement, though, is about as straightforward as a maze made by someone who's never seen a compass. For starters, there's the lingering question of whether France actually had the right to bombard an entire foreign port city over a private citizen's bakery claim. Even then, international law was murky at best, and this case became a fascinating subject of academic debate for decades afterward. Some legal scholars insisted France was justified under the growing concept of gunboat diplomacy, while others laughed outright, noting that even by 19th century standards, it was overkill in the most pastry-fueled way. Meanwhile, Mexico agreed to pay the compensation, But surprise, very little of it was actually paid, and what was paid came in agonizingly slow installments. You could almost picture Monsieur Ramonto sitting on his porch in Paris, tapping his foot impatiently, muttering, "I could have built an entire pastry empire by now." Still, France was mostly content with the result, as they'd flexed their naval muscles, disrupted Mexico's economy, and reminded the world that France was not above turning puff pastry into cannon fodder. Yet for Mexico, the whole event left a bad taste in the mouth, more bitter than a burnt milfia. In Mexican political circles, the war reignited arguments about military readiness, foreign policy, independence, and national dignity. Santa Anna, having played the part of wounded war hero yet again, used the incident to bolster his standing and slowly begin weaving his return to power. Even though everyone knew he exaggerated how dramatically he lost his leg, according to some contemporary reports, he insisted it was a selfless act of defense, when in truth, he may have simply placed himself a little too close to the French cannons during the final skirmish. In fringe corners of the academic world, some historians to this day argued that Santa Anna might have staged his injury to play the martyr, knowing full well that a limping hero with a dramatic past always makes for better political theater. Regardless, the post-war months were a flurry of finger-pointing and paper shuffling. French newspapers largely forgot the incident, preferring to focus on the monarchy's struggles with Republicans and growing unrest in Algeria. Mexican newspapers, on the other hand, remained divided, some mocking the entire affair as a European farce, others furious that their homeland had once again been subject to European humiliation. If you listened closely at night, in some corners of Mexico City, you might even hear bar patrons sarcastically toasting to La Gran Guerra del Pastel, the Great Pastry War. Even Mexico's Catholic clergy had opinions, some viewing it as divine punishment for political instability, others claiming it was proof of foreign greed. It was during this time that the phrase, "War of the Cakes," began to be whispered with both satire and shame. In modern classrooms, it's often cited as one of the most comically named wars in history, rivaling conflicts like the War of the Oaken Bucket or the Emu War. Still, beneath the humor was a very real set of consequences: a damaged economy, a battered naval infrastructure, and citizens questioning how long their country could withstand foreign bullying. A lesser-known scholarly theory proposes that the pastry war marked the beginning of a new global precedent, using minor financial claims as justification for military action. It wasn't about cakes, they argue it was about setting the rules for empire in the 19th century. That theory remains debated, but it does lend a strange gravitas to an otherwise absurd episode. In one particularly quirky footnote to the story, a letter was discovered in the early 1900s, penned by a minor French diplomat who'd served in Mexico during the conflict. In it, he described how even the French soldiers had trouble keeping a straight face while preparing for battle over a pastry claim. And one sergeant allegedly asked, "So, are we firing over buttercream or jam today?" That letter is now kept in the French National Archives, an accidental gem of levity in the otherwise rigid folders of colonial military campaigns. Whether anyone truly believed this war would change history is another open question. But it did manage to lodge itself in the memory of historians, satirists, and bored YouTube viewers, alike reminding us all that sometimes global conflict doesn't need oil or gold or ideology. Sometimes all it takes is a broken window and a particularly vindictive baker. The curious fate of Monsieur Ramontel, the pastry war's accidental catalyst, long after the last cannon fired and the French ships sailed back to Europe in triumphant boredom, and long after diplomats declared peace with all the sincerity of someone signing for a lost parcel, there remained one unlikely man whose name was still spoken in whispers and jokes across two continents: Monsieur Ramonto, the pastry chef of Peralvillo, a man whose stubborn insistence on justice, or perhaps just compensation for broken ovens, had helped ignite a war. But who was this man really, and what became of him after the crumbs of conflict settled? Ramonto was not a celebrity or a politician, not a general, nor even a particularly famous baker. In fact, some records suggest that even in the bustling markets of Mexico City, his little shop was modest and unremarkable, known more for reliability than innovation. No eclat that could stop your heart. No puff pastries that sang songs of heavenly butter. Just daily bread, small cakes, and quiet dignity. But in 1828, his life took a bizarre turn when a group of Mexican officers, reportedly drunk and unpaid, ransacked his bakery during a local riot. They shattered windows, stomped cakes into the ground, and left without so much as a receipt. Tried everything from local magistrates to letters to the president. But no one cared to reimburse a foreigner for a few ruined croissants. That's when he turned to the French government. Some say it was an act of desperation. Others claim it was part of a growing practice where foreign nationals would exaggerate minor grievances in the hope of attracting diplomatic attention. But whatever the case, Remontel's claim traveled across oceans, wrapped in the language of international insult. To the French ministry, it wasn't just about one baker, it was about national pride. The safety of French citizens abroad, and the unspoken rule that European lives, and by extension, livelihoods were not to be trampled by unstable republics. Remontel, once a humble tradesman, became a symbol of injured European virtue. His claim for 60,000 pesos, a figure most historians believe was wildly inflated, sparked arguments in cabinet rooms, telegrams between naval officers, and ultimately a military expedition. But the strangest part of Remontel's story is what came next. For years after the war, his name faded from public discourse. There are no statues of him in Paris, no streets named Remontel in Mexico. His bakery never reopened in Paravilo either. Some claim he returned to France, a wealthy man, having finally received a small portion of the compensation thanks to treaty pressure. Others insist he remained in Mexico, bitter and disillusioned, unable to shake the guilt of having indirectly caused a naval bombardment and a brief occupation. A single surviving letter, archived in a dusty Mexican university library, may provide a clue. It's a short note, unsigned but widely believed to be his, dated 1845. What I asked for was justice, but I did not ask for war. The ovens can be rebuilt. The dead cannot. Whether this quote is authentic remains debated, but it perfectly captures the tragic absurdity of the situation. For in truth, Remontel was neither hero nor villain. He was simply a man who wanted someone to fix what had been broken, never imagining that nations might start counting casualties instead of cakes. Some contemporary plays and satire pamphlets of the 1840s even featured caricatures of him a round-faced, mustachioed baker angrily shaking a rolling pin at a globe, while generals behind him load cannons full of eclairs. These depictions only added to the mythos. Remontel, the baker who declared war. In modern classrooms, students often chuckle when they hear his name. They imagine him as a kind of cartoon character, oblivious to the storm he created. But to understand Remontel properly is to understand the way ordinary lives can get swept up in the absurd logic of empires. He wasn't just a baker. He became a symbol, a talking point, a diplomatic tool. His personal suffering was turned into political leverage, and his identity was consumed by headlines. Even in the years after the war, whenever France found itself in another foreign entanglement, be it in Indochina, Algeria, or West Africa, critics would occasionally invoke his name. Will this be another Remontel affair? In this way, the baker's legacy lived on not in powdered sugar and sponge cakes, but in parliamentary debates and diplomatic side-eyes. Curiously, decades later, in the 1870s, a Parisian bakery named Maison Remontel briefly opened in the Montmartre district, its window displaying pastries shaped like tiny cannons and tricolor eclairs. But the owner claimed no relation to the original Remontel. When asked why he chose the name, he allegedly laughed and said, "Because nothing makes war sweeter than sugar." Whether this was a tongue-in-cheek tribute or capitalist opportunism is anyone's guess. Either way, it illustrates how the name Remontel had become more than a man. It was now a metaphor for ridiculous conflict, for bureaucracy turned farce, and for the strange, often tragic ways history remembers the smallest players. Today, if you visit the quiet neighborhood of Paravilo in Mexico City, there are no plaques marking the site of Remontel's bakery. The streets have changed, the buildings replaced, and the chaos of the 19th century feels like a distant whisper. But somewhere beneath the pavement, in the layers of a city built on revolution and memory, the ghost of a stubborn baker might still be baking just as one imagined pastry at a time. When Mexico defaulted, how pastries turned into naval blockades, and national humiliation, as absurd as it may seem to go to war over a pastry shop. The real fuel behind the so-called pastry war was less about flaky desserts and more about flaking debts. At its core, the entire debacle revealed a deeper problem simmering beneath the surface: Mexico's chronic financial instability and Europe's growing impatience with being left unpaid. After gaining independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico had inherited not only the physical remnants of a colonial system, but also its economic disarray. The young republic was plagued by a carousel of short-lived governments, constant infighting, and the Herculean challenge of trying to build a functioning financial system from the rubble of revolution. For European creditors, especially France and Britain, Mexico became a country of endless IOUs and unpaid reparations. Loans were made, promises signed, and yet payments rarely arrived. France, in particular, had grown tired of sending polite letters that went ignored. So, by the time Monsieur Riemental's complaint arrived, it didn't matter whether it involved cream puffs or croissants. It became a convenient excuse to finally act. The French government, under King Louis Philippe, decided it had had enough of diplomacy. In 1838, they issued an ultimatum: pay 600,000 pesos or face consequences. This figure, of course, far exceeded the value of any single bakery, but it bundled together multiple French grievances from years of chaos in Mexico: trade disputes, unpaid loans, mistreatment of French nationals, all of it swirled together into one tidy and outrageously large bill. When Mexico refused to pay, citing national sovereignty and financial incapacity, France sent its navy to enforce the demand. Thus began one of the more surreal moments in Latin American history. Warships in the Gulf of Mexico, blockading the port of Veracruz, not over land or gold or honor, but as restitution for alleged damages to French citizens, with pastries as the headline-grabbing detail. On November 27, 1838, the French Navy attacked the fort of San Juan de Ulua, launching a barrage of cannon fire that stunned onlookers and severely damaged Mexican defenses. The fort's defenders fought back, but the imbalance of power was clear. France, a major European power with advanced ships and artillery, was essentially bullying a much weaker nation in chaos. President Anastasio Bustamante, whose tenure had already been marked by instability, was caught in an impossible position. He needed to protect national pride, but the Mexican treasury was nearly empty. There was no easy way to raise the ransom, France demanded, and diplomatic channels had broken down. As days turned into weeks, the blockade strangled Mexican commerce. Veracruz was a critical artery for imports and exports. With it sealed off, the Mexican economy bled out slowly. Businesses folded, prices skyrocketed. Discontent festered. Meanwhile, the Mexican press mocked the French invasion with a mixture of gallows humor and nationalist outrage, calling it La Guerra de los Pasteles, the pastry war, a name that would stick through history. The joke hid a deeper humiliation. Mexico was being strong-armed over a claim that most Mexicans believed was exaggerated or fabricated altogether. But while the French were laughing all the way to the treasury, Mexico's problems deepened. The country lacked the resources to mount a strong military counterattack, and public confidence in the government dwindled. Some politicians privately urged surrender, while others wanted to call on Britain or the United States to mediate. Eventually, the British did step in. Worried that the blockade might spiral into a wider conflict or destabilize trade in the Americas, British diplomats brokered a deal between the two sides. In early 1839, Mexico agreed to pay the 600,000 pesos in damages, though in practice, payments were delayed, partial, or symbolic, and France withdrew its ships. For France, the operation had been a military and symbolic success. They demonstrated European dominance without major casualties. For Mexico, the affair was deeply embarrassing. Not only had they been coerced into a settlement, but the conflict highlighted just how fragile their young republic remained, and yet the outcome was not entirely negative. The war ignited a debate inside Mexico about national finances and the need for reform. It exposed the vulnerabilities of relying on foreign credit and highlighted how small disputes could escalate into geopolitical crises. In the following years, various administrations attempted to stabilize the currency, reduce debt, and avoid the Pastry War served as a cautionary tale. But this was not the last time Mexico would suffer such indignities. In the decades that followed, the country would find itself invaded again by the Americans in 1846, and later, by the French once more in the 1860s during the infamous installation of Emperor Maximilian. Each time, unpaid debts and foreign claims would play a role. In retrospect, the Pastry War appears almost comical compared to these larger conflicts. Yet it marks a turning point, a strange and sugary milestone in the long history of imperial pressure, economic dependency, and national dignity. Today, historians look back on it, not only for its absurd premise, but for what it revealed about the relationship between powerful, creditor nations and vulnerable emerging states. In classrooms, it is taught as a footnote, a historical curiosity. But in those 6 weeks of bombardment and blockade, a fragile republic was forced to confront the brutal reality that even minor financial lapses could invite cannons. And behind every ridiculous war name lies a serious story about how the world works. The image of pastries triggering war might be funny, but it masks the tragic truth that nations have often used the smallest pretexts to justify the biggest displays of force. For Mexico, this lesson came early and at the cost of sovereignty, dignity, and yes, probably some pretty decent cakes. National identity in crumbs. How the Pastry War haunts Mexican memory and reinvented patriotism in the years following the so-called Pastry War. Mexico found itself deeply shaken not because it had lost significant territory or suffered staggering casualties, but because it had endured a humiliating episode that revealed just how brittle its national image had become. This was not a conventional war, fought for land or survival, but rather a symbolic standoff where a foreign power humiliated the republic by weaponizing its debts and exposing its vulnerabilities to the world. The memory of that embarrassment lingered like a bitter aftertaste, one that influenced political rhetoric, public consciousness, and historical narratives for generations, while the name La Guerra de los Pasteles may elicit a chuckle. The way it lodged itself into Mexico's cultural psyche is anything but lighthearted. This was the first time in Mexico's young life, as an independent nation, that a European power had taken overt military action under the guise of protecting its citizens' commercial interests. And worse, the flimsy justification of Baker's claim of 60,000 pesos for stolen tarts cast the entire event in a surreal, almost slapstick tone that made the humiliation more acute. It wasn't just that Mexico had been blockaded and shelled it. It was that the world saw it happen over deserts. This absurdity had the unintended effect of amplifying Mexican nationalism. The press and political cartoonists wasted no time in turning the French into figures of ridicule, portraying them as greedy imperialists obsessed with pastries, and casting Remontal as the ultimate traitor and opportunist whose invited foreign cannons onto Mexican soil. He was caricatured in satirical poems, depicted in crude illustrations, and openly mocked in political gatherings. For many Mexicans, he became the scapegoat for a larger crisis of dignity, a convenient symbol of how foreign meddling could masquerade as justice. But this episode also catalyzed something more profound, a reevaluation of Mexican patriotism. Writers, poets, and early historians began weaving a narrative in which Mexico was not merely a detritus republic, it was a noble underdog, constantly besieged by the greedy hands of more powerful nations. The Pastry War joined the pantheon of national struggles, where the odds were stacked against Mexico, yet the nation endured with its spirit intact. The absurdity of the war's cause became part of the rallying cry. If a foreign navy could be summoned over cakes, then surely the people of Mexico needed to be more vigilant in defending their sovereignty. Not just with arms, but with unity. Schools began teaching the Pastry War in the context of foreign exploitation. The war's lesson was simple. Mexico had to be wary of the smiling face of trade and diplomacy, for behind it could lie a loaded cannon. Remontal's bakery became a cautionary tale. No longer just a place of sweets, it symbolized the dangers of internal weakness and foreign opportunism. In the decades that followed, street names, Small monuments and public squares quietly incorporated references to the war, not to glorify it, but to remember it as a lesson in pride and self-respect. Some civic leaders even proposed laws limiting foreign property ownership in certain areas, citing events like the Pastry War as proof that economic entanglements with powerful nations could lead to political disasters. For a brief period, it became common for political candidates to invoke the war during campaigns, promising to never again let foreign grievances dictate national policy. Even as newer wars arrived, such as the Mexican-American War and the French intervention in the 1860s, the Pastry War remained etched in memory as the first insult, the moment when the world underestimated Mexico and laughed. That laughter, however, became a source of fuel. Military reforms were quietly debated in the aftermath, and while many were not fully realized, the conflict underscored the need for a stronger navy, better coastal defenses, and more competent fiscal policy. Ministers began to push for more transparent national accounting and reforms in foreign debt management, hoping to avoid future pretexts for intervention. In literature and popular art, the war took on a life of its own. Playwrights and satirists used it as a device to critique contemporary corruption, implying that unless Mexico changed, it might one day face another war of pastries. It became a shorthand phrase for absurdity, yes, but also for caution. And so, the Pastry War, despite its brevity and low casualty count, had permanently embedded itself in the country's soul. In modern Mexico, the war is still taught, usually as a curious anecdote from the 19th century. But in more reflective circles, among scholars, nationalists, and cultural historians, it's considered a crucial point of inflection, a moment where the nation glimpsed the dark underbelly of foreign relations and realized that weakness, whether military or economic, would always invite interference. For the French, the war was a footnote, a successful exercise in gunboat diplomacy, and a reminder of the power imbalance between Europe and Latin America. For Mexico, it was a humiliation turned into a historical scar, the kind that reminds a nation not of defeat, but of what it must never allow again. In fact, one could argue that the absurdity of the cause made it even more effective as a national memory tool, a battle lost over pastries. It stuck in the mind, teaching generations about vigilance, pride, and the importance of fiscal responsibility far more effectively than any dry lecture could. Children learned the tale and laughed at the name. But beneath that laughter was a subtle lesson. Sovereignty is fragile, and the world doesn't always play fair. What began as a baker's inflated claim ended up redefining the way a nation saw itself and how it interacted with the world. That's the true legacy of the Pastry War, the cannonballs fired, or pesos paid. But the awakening it sparked in a young republic, trying to find its place in a world that viewed it as little more than a joke. And while jokes fade, the sting of their truth often lingers far longer. The baker who started a war, Monsieur Ramonto's afterlife in history and myth as decades turned into centuries. The strange tale of Monsieur Ramonto, the French baker, whose damaged pastries triggered a bombardment of Mexico, refused to fade quietly into the dusty corners of obscure diplomatic affairs. Instead, Ramonto's name curiously endured, becoming a cultural phantom woven into the folk history of Mexico and France alike. His tiny claim of 60,000 pesos for alleged losses, probably exaggerated beyond recognition, set off international fireworks, and his bakery became the unlikely ground zero of a war. For some, he was an opportunistic villain. For others, merely a symbol of how minor players can unwittingly shape massive events. His life after the war, while largely undocumented in detail, was reconstructed by scholars and storytellers who could not resist the eccentricity of his legacy. Ramonto himself did not command armies, write policy, or even build a political movement. And yet, his exaggerated grievance with the Mexican government was taken seriously enough by France to justify deploying its navy, blockading a capital, bombarding fortifications, and demanding payment backed by cannon fire. The weight of this absurd equation suites for siege turned Ramonto into an almost mythic figure. In Mexico, over time, his name was reduced to a cultural shorthand. Ramonto represented the dangers of economic manipulation, foreign interference, and national weakness. He was mentioned in political debates long after his death, usually in ridicule, and became the butt of satirical plays and jokes. In one widely circulated 19th century editorial, a fictionalized Remontal was depicted trying to sell a tart to the president himself, saying, "Eat it now, or I'll summon a fleet." The idea that a man's baked goods could have national consequences was so absurd that it stuck, transforming him into a sort of bogeyman for cautionary political tales. Schoolchildren would sometimes hear the story retold as a parable. If you don't defend your country's honor, even a baker can become your conqueror. The phrase, "Don't let Remontal happen again," even crept into speeches calling for stronger national defense and financial reform. And yet, his story was not simply one of scorn. Over time, some voices began to re-evaluate Remontal's role. Was he truly a manipulative schemer, or just a pawn in a larger geopolitical game? Some historians argued that Remontal may have been exploited by French officials eager for a reason to flex their military muscle in Latin America. These revisionist views suggested that he had filed a legitimate claim, perhaps exaggerated. Yes, but then had his name weaponized by the French government for diplomatic gain. In this reading, Remontal wasn't the villain, but rather the trigger pulled by others. In France, especially in the late 19th century, his role was often celebrated with quiet smugness. In French naval records and diplomatic memoirs, Remontal was described as a brave French citizen standing up for his rights in a lawless land. To them, his case symbolized the justification of force to protect citizens abroad. In Parisian coffeehouses, where tales of French grandeur and civilizing missions were often traded with pride. The Baker of Veracruz was an amusing but affirming footnote in the story of France's global reach. But even there, as decades passed and colonial ambitions soured into historical regret, Remontal's name became more curious than glorious, a relic of a time when absurdity and imperial arrogance went hand in hand. By the 20th century, artists and filmmakers began to rediscover Remontal's story, fascinated by its surreal tone. A few Mexican theater companies staged comedic plays, imagining the baker's trial in a fictional court, with characters like General Santa Anna, President Bustamante, and even Napoleon's ghost appearing as witnesses. The plays leaned into absurdity, highlighting the ridiculousness of war caused by baked goods, but also the danger of letting trivial grievances become tools of international bullying. In one modern film proposal which never reached production, Remontal was to be portrayed as a tragicomic figure, desperately trying to collect his insurance claim while being sucked into a geopolitical vortex he didn't understand. While no verified photos of Remontal survive, artists often imagined him with a chef's hat and a scheming face, baking pies with gunpowder or frosting with cannonball patterns. One muralist in Veracruz even painted a large street piece in the 1980s, showing Remontal atop a pile of eclairs, flanked by French soldiers on one side and angry Mexican townsfolk on the other. The caption read, "Be careful what you bake for." Meanwhile, in historical journals, his story began appearing in studies of diplomatic absurdity, colonial overreach, and the unpredictable role of private citizens in shaping global history. Remontal was often compared to the likes of Gavrilo Princip, though obviously on a much more comedic scale. The comparison was less about impact and more about the curious way individual people can accidentally become the hinge of history. In some academic circles, the term Remontal effect was coined to describe moments when minor personal grievances snowball into international incidents. And in Mexican pop culture, the phrase, "he must be baking trouble," like Remontal, was occasionally used in memes and comedy sketches to describe someone overreacting or stirring up conflict for petty reasons. Even in the culinary world, Remontal's ghost lingers. Some bakeries in Veracruz and Mexico City began offering novelty pastries called Remontal's Revenge, usually a flaky tart dusted with powdered sugar and shaped like a cannon or a naval ship. These were especially popular around the anniversary of the Pastry War's start. The irony of eating pastries in remembrance of a war over pastries wasn't lost on anyone, it was embraced. In one festival, children were invited to reenact the bakery's destruction using paper match cannons and edible tarts. In these odd and charming ways, Monsieur Remontal became something more than a baker. He became a cultural metaphor, a lens through which people examined the absurdity of politics. the fragility of national dignity, and the often hilarious overlap between the personal and the political. His ghost haunts not just the history books, but street murals, classroom jokes, and pastry shops. While historians may debate his exact motivations and the legitimacy of his claims, there is little debate about the outsized footprint he left behind. Not many bakers can say their complaint caused warships to sail and cities to shake. Fewer still have been remembered for centuries because of it. In this way, Remental occupies a unique position in the annals of unintended consequence. He wasn't a general, a king, or a revolutionary, but he got the world's attention, and somehow, in the great theater of history, that made him unforgettable. Of cannons and cream puffs, how newspapers turned the pastry war into satire, propaganda, and political comedy when the first cannonball was fired by the French at the port of Veracruz in late 1838. The thunderclap of war echoed not only across the Gulf of Mexico but also across the printing presses of two continents. Journalists, pamphleteers, cartoonists, and political satirists seized the moment with ink-stained glee. It was, after all, nearly impossible to resist. France, the land of high cuisine and revolutionary fare, was launching a military assault on Mexico not over stolen land, murdered diplomats, or sunk ships, but over a pastry shop. This juxtaposition between the refined and the ridiculous, the imperial and the edible, was journalistic gold. In Paris, the reaction in the press was a mix of smug pride and comic embarrassment. The official line from government-friendly newspapers was that French honor had been insulted and must be restored. They emphasized the broader diplomatic context: France's demands for unpaid debts, mistreatment of its citizens in Mexico, and protection of French nationals. But even as they printed the formal diplomatic language, they couldn't help but print political cartoons featuring caricatures of Mexican bandits running off with croissants, or King Louis Philippe peering into a bakery window holding a telescope and muttering, "A crisis is rising." In one widely circulated Parisian cartoon, a French admiral was depicted yelling "fire" as bakers behind him launched cream pies at Veracruz from a giant slingshot. The war, at least 4 readers of the satirical press, had turned into something between a kitchen farce and a military burlesque. In Mexico, however, the press was more varied. Government-aligned newspapers condemned the French aggression in passionate tones, calling it a humiliating overreaction and evidence of European arrogance. Editorials described Remental's claim as a pretext, mocking the idea that a few smashed eclairs could justify naval bombardment. Yet even in outrage, the humor crept in. One Veracruz broadsheet sarcastically reported that the French had marched to war, armed with spatulas and threats of tart justice. Another paper published a poem describing how Don Croissant, a fictional French general made entirely of puff pastry, arrived on Mexican shores only to melt in the sun. But the Mexican press also used the war as an opportunity for serious political reflection. Newspapers began asking, how could a single French citizen so easily shake our national sovereignty? Why were our military fortifications so poorly maintained? Why had our government failed to diplomatically address these minor grievances before they escalated into an international spectacle? These questions became central themes in Mexican political commentary throughout the conflict, and the satire, when scathing, often masked deeper anxieties about political instability and foreign manipulation. In Britain and the United States, the pastry war became a curiosity, the kind of odd diplomatic squabble that filled newspapers in the foreign pages under headings like Affairs Abroad or News of the Curious. British journalists, always keen to poke fun at their French rivals, found the entire episode delightful. The London Times called it a most remarkable demonstration of the French affinity for culinary justice. British satirical magazine Punch had a field day, printing illustrations of Napoleon's ghost appearing to Louis Philippe, demanding to know why he was now fighting over donuts instead of destiny. A popular British ditty set to the tune of Yankee Doodle went. Frenchmen stormed a pastry shop with muskets in their hand. All for some eclairs and tarts, they bombed a foreign land. In the United States, commentary was more reserved, but still tinged with humor. Papers in New Orleans and New York printed sarcastic updates on the pie war and speculated whether coffee merchants or hat makers would next require armed protection However, some American voices warned that the conflict reflected France's growing imperial ambition in Latin America, concern that would later influence U.S. policy under the Monroe Doctrine. Meanwhile, in the streets, cafes, and taverns, ordinary people talked about the war as if it were a joke come to life. Nicknames abounded: the Cake Crusade, War of the Baguettes, Donut Diplomacy. These terms, while playful, spread widely and helped solidify the absurd reputation of the conflict. In both France and Mexico, theater troupes rushed to stage comedic plays about the war. These performances often mixed historical figures with ridiculous fantasies. Santa Anna might appear as a chef-turned general, while Ramonta was played as a weeping clown, demanding reparation in cinnamon rolls. These light-hearted portrayals helped the public process the embarrassment and absurdity of the situation. But satire was not always harmless. In Mexico, the ridicule surrounding the Pastry War was sometimes used to discredit political leaders. Santa Anna, though he had rallied troops and lost a leg in battle during the conflict, was mocked in opposition papers as someone who would do anything to return to power, even if it meant defending a Claris with artillery. His detractors argued that he used the war to manipulate his way back into public life, a charge that stuck with him in later years. Some papers even printed fake interviews with Ramonta, in which he bragged about being Mexico's new president of pastries. Across the Atlantic, the French satirical press occasionally turned its sharp pen inward. Some writers questioned why a nation that prided itself on revolutionary principles and Enlightenment values was now sending gunboats over damaged goods. These dissenting voices weren't necessarily defending Mexico, but rather criticizing the spectacle of state power being used for what many considered a bourgeois complaint. Even Victor Hugo reportedly referenced the absurdity of the affair in his journals, noting how sometimes the crust of empire is thinnest where pride meets commerce. In the years after the war ended, as Mexico paid the demanded sum and France withdrew its forces, the press continued to reflect on the absurdity of the conflict. Retrospectives in newspapers treated it as an anomaly, a diplomatic farce, rather than a real war. Still, it became a defining symbol of the era, constantly revisited in columns, essays, and parodies. The Pastry War proved, if anything, that public perception of international events was just as important as the events themselves. And when perception leaned toward laughter, that legacy could endure longer than any treaty. Long after the guns had silenced and the treaties had faded into legal archives, the pens of cartoonists, the ink of playwrights, and the humor of the common people ensured that the Pastry War would never be forgotten. Not because of the damage it caused or the lives it changed, but because it was proof that history sometimes unfolds not with a bang, but with a flaky, buttery crunch.